Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to cover the differences between big companies and small companies, and hopefully as I'm going through it, it will help you decide whether you're more suited to a big company or more suited to a small company. So before we jump into it, I think it's a really good idea to try and define what a small company is or what a big company is. So when you Google it, what will come up is a definition around SMEs, which is small to medium enterprises, and that in the UK and Europe is around the 250 figure, which means that anything under 250 people in a company represents a small to medium enterprise. But in my mind, that's on the high side, because anytime you do any reading around business books or if you listen to any startup podcasts, anything like that, you'll learn that there's this thing called Dunbar's number, which is essentially a number that represents 150 people. And it's 150 people that you can remember or you can have relationships with. So what you'll find is that even in large organisations that employ thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, what they'll do is try and break departments up into 150 people because they know that that's the magic number that essentially is cohesive and helps people work together more collaboratively, and ultimately they get more output out of it. So that's what I would consider essentially the difference between a small company and a big company, is around that 150 marker point. So now that we've defined that, let's jump straight into it. Number one, bureaucracy. What this means is basically the bigger the company gets, the harder it is for anything to get done. So one of the previous companies I worked for, I came as employee number 12, and by the time I left, they were nearly at 200. And this was one of the biggest changes I saw, was the bureaucracy side of things. And basically, you've got to remember, when a company's little, you get a lot of one-on-one time with the owners, or you've got a lot of access to them in terms of being able to give them a call, that type of thing. And what that means is that you obviously get to understand what decisions they would make. And often as well is that coupled with that is they give you a lot more power to make decisions because you've got a lot closer relationship and they trust your judgment, and therefore they don't want to be involved in all the decisions that are being made. Now what you'd think is that as a company grows, you would think that the company would hand out more responsibility to more employees. But that's not what happens. It's kind of the opposite of what happens. Obviously now there's so many new staff in there that they're worried that if they give that type of autonomy to this many number of employees, obviously bad decisions can stack up to cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So actually what tends to happen is that a bottleneck effect happens, which means that even where you may have had autonomy in the past, that might be taken away from you because now there's layers of management above you. So a company could bring in an MD or any types of those positions underneath the CEO or the CFO. And what happens is that you now have to obviously report to them because obviously you'll be undermining them if you try to go around them. So what you have to remember in these big companies is that there's actually very few people that have financial sign-off. So to give you a live example of this, I was working on a site many years ago where we as a developer owned the whole site and we were sending off parcels to different developers as well as building it ourselves. Now when we were doing that, that meant that we were interacting with obviously some very big developers, far bigger than what we were. And there was a bit of work that needed to be done, essentially where the cost needed to be split between us, but we needed to agree what the percentage split was between the two. So at the time, I was a project manager and the person who I was speaking to was the construction director of one of the sort of biggest developers in the UK. Now you would think that he would have more power than me to negotiate the deal, but ultimately we were talking about something that was a few £1,000s. So I went in there thinking, oh, we're going to be able to thrash this out because I knew that my boss trusted me to be able to negotiate. But ultimately what happened is that we started the conversation, and on his side of things, he was like, I don't have any financial control of this. So in a very, very big company and a big developer in the UK, the construction director, which you would see as a very senior position, actually had no financial control over something that was very, very small. And I kind of walked away and I remember having a conversation with my girlfriend that night saying, like, how do they get anything done? Because actually everything in that company has to be funneled through the CEO. And that's such a good example of how bottlenecked big companies get. So if this is something that you think about, or you want some power or autonomy in your role in the future, that's one of the issues you'll probably have in these big organisations. Family versus colleagues. So in big companies, obviously the people you get to know and obviously develop relationships tend to be in your team. Outside of that, it can be very difficult to build relationships. Obviously in big companies, while the percentage of turnover of staff may be small, actually because they're so big, the numbers actually feel like that people are coming and going all the time, i.e. new people are starting and old people are leaving the business. So you kind of get this feeling that when you're working for them, that is it even worth building relationships with people, because it just feels like there's this constant influx and outgoings of people. Whereas obviously in small companies, they're very, very personable. So you'll know everybody's name in all the different departments. And the other thing is that when it comes to things like birthdays, obviously they'll celebrate birthdays in big companies. Obviously in big companies, birthdays can be happening 2 or 3 times a day. So what you'll find is that maybe teams will celebrate it off their own backs, but as a company policy, they won't endorse things like birthdays. I think the other thing to point out on this is that smaller companies tend to have your back a lot bigger than bigger companies. So in a smaller company, say a customer makes a complaint about you, is that because they know you so much better, they can kind of listen to a customer and think, no, that's not the right description of James. That doesn't sound like something he would say. So therefore, they tend to sort of fight your corner for you. But in a big company, obviously you would have seen a lot of films, and it's very true, is that you can obviously get situations where your boss pretends that your work is his, or that they can sort of slag you off behind your back. So that's a big thing in a big company, is that because there's so many layers, there's often so many meetings where you'll be talked about, but you won't know the context of it. So you may have worked really, really hard on something, and ultimately your boss could go and take the credit for it, unjustly so. But because you're not in that room and able to get that sort of conversation or get across how hard you've worked on something, or because there's so many layers between you and ultimately the boss, it's just not coming across how much effort you're putting into it. So that's a really good difference between the two types of companies. Number 3, jack of all trades. So obviously in small companies, there's just not as many specialisms or expertise across the board. So what happens is that obviously where you being a minnow and you might be fighting with big companies, it means that you'll have to jump in and help different departments along the way. And it's kind of expected that in a little company that you'll have to have that type of attitude, that you're not bothered about helping in different areas of the business and maybe helping out at weekends, that type of stuff. But what that means is that if you've got any aspirations of owning your own company in the future, is that I think that's such a great opportunity to actually get one-on-one time. So using like accounts is a really good example. In big companies, you may never go over to the accounts department, but obviously in little companies, you're on a first name basis, you're spending a lot of, say, potentially one-on-one time with them. And what that means is that obviously you're getting an education, maybe at a basic level, but you're getting an education that in the big company you're just not going to get. So if you do have those aspirations in the future to want to run your own business, obviously it's highly likely that business is going to be small, and this is just such a good way of actually understanding how the dynamics of a company works at that scale. So if ever you want to start up in the future, you've got that great insight. Number 4, rules. So a good way of looking at rules is like HR policies. So in small companies, HR policies can probably be described as something more along the lines of like moralistic. So what I mean by that is that if you work the weekend, say, and give up your time, obviously your boss is going to know that you did that. So they might say to you, have a half day on Monday, or don't come in on Friday, for instance. So it's very much fluid in terms of watching what you're doing and then giving back wherever they can, which is obviously something that doesn't go on in big companies. So what happens in big companies is that obviously they have big HR departments, and it's kind of like the rule setters of what goes out across the board. So a really good example of this is things like pay is a really good one, where so many companies have a HR policy that's super, super rigid, which means that once a year you'll get your pay rise or your pay review. And ultimately, you'll very often have very little say or conversation about that. It might be your boss or even your boss's boss that decides how the pay gets distributed. And it might be your boss's boss has no relationship with you whatsoever. So you kind of think, how can they make a call on my pay rise? So what will happen is that potentially your department might get a rollout of exactly the same pay rise, but ultimately you'll be sitting there thinking, well, hold on, I worked really hard last year and my colleague barely did anything, he just turned up. And how is that fair? So then you'll go and have a conversation with your boss and they'll say, oh, well, maybe next year there'll be something. Or they might even fob you off for a little time and say, oh, I'll have a conversation. But ultimately, they'll go back to HR and HR will say, we only review it once a year, we can't do anything. So say you go home, you think about it and you think, it just doesn't sit right with me. Like I feel like I've put a lot of effort into trying to get on and obviously get that promotion or get that pay rise. And then you go back to work the following week and have a chat with your boss and say, look, I'm going to hand in my resignation, here it is. And miraculously, the HR rule can be changed and that they don't want you to go, so therefore they're now willing to listen to you. And that's the thing with big companies, is that they create all these HR policies and they say that they're super, super rigid and we can't change anything. But it's the same thing as what little companies are. It's still people, and it's ultimately down to people as to whether they're willing to help you out or whether they're willing to fight to keep you. But it's just a really good example of how things are different in small companies to big companies, is that small company can obviously be a bit more moralistic and look at your effort levels, and obviously the boss is seeing your effort levels, so you can get some benefits that way compared to this HR policy system, which is that, going back to that weekend example, they're just not going to cut you any slack. It's kind of like, well, you need to get your work done. If that's what it took, that's what it took. So that's a really good way of looking at the two differences. Number 5, specialization. So a good way of looking at specialization is that previously I said in small companies that they're jack of all trades, but obviously in big companies you can get really, really specialized roles. So just to break the water on this in terms of explaining it, is that in previous videos I explained what the QS role is like, that in small companies the QS will not only do the QS role, but they'll also do estimating, which is that they'll look after existing projects they've got, but they'll also be bidding on new work. But obviously in big companies, you won't have that. The estimators will purely be bidding on work all the new time, or like bid managers, they'll purely just be bidding on work coming in, and they won't get involved in the project once it goes live. So that's a really good example of that. But then you also get another layer on top of that, which is something like Kat's role, who's the company secretary. Obviously in little companies, there's just not a need for something like a company secretary. So Kat will be involved in companies that obviously employ hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, because at that level, she's obviously advising the board of directors and giving governance information around that. So that's a really good example that you may be interested in a job that ultimately is very, very specialized. So therefore you'll need to be looking at the big companies that obviously employ thousands of people rather than the little companies. Number 6, opportunities to change roles. So obviously in big companies, they've got so many different roles. So going back to the example I just gave with QS, obviously QS in estimating, there's a lot of overlap there. So a lot of companies will let you move from one thing to another. But another really good example of this is Phil's interview, where he explained that he's worked for the same company for over 10 years and he's had so many different jobs. So he went from being an electrical engineer when he first started out into an electrical estimator. Then he went into being a planner, which is like working on things like the program. And then from there, he's gone into being a bid manager, which is essentially like estimating. So it's so diverse what he's been able to move across from one department to another. And that's what I think is really cool about big companies, is that I explained in my video why you didn't get the job, that's one of the big things that goes on in companies, is that ultimately they like to see internal movement of people rather than hiring in new people. Because even though they might not have the skill set of a different department, they know that person, they know that personality. And that's one of the big things that obviously happens in interviews, is they're looking for personalities and how they're going to gel with people. And obviously when that's an internal person, they obviously know that person's personality well. They've probably known them for years, like with Phil. And therefore they don't see it as a big risk to move Phil from one department to another, because they obviously know his capabilities. So obviously if you're not sure what you want to do for a career choice, going to a big company can really help you out in this way, because obviously you might go in and thinking, oh, this is what I want to do. And then obviously you might start that role and be a year in and think this isn't for me. And in a big company, you'll get that opportunity to say, look, I don't think this is working out. I think I'll be better suited to this. And you can have a chat with your boss about moving across. And that's something that Phil talks about in the video, is that he's had those conversations, but then he's also had conversations where his bosses have said, hey, you might be better suited to moving in this direction. So that's a really cool thing about big companies. So there you have it. There's some really good differences between what a big business is like and what a small business is like. And as I said, like using the small business advantages, if you're someone that likes a lot of autonomy or control over what they're doing, or if you like that one-on-one aspect and be able to learn or have future ambitions of running your own business, and I think that's really good call for you. On the other side, if you're not sure what you want to do, or you're looking at a highly specialized career, then obviously big businesses are really, really good for helping you out with that. Another thing to consider is something like prestige or the size of the project. Obviously, in my interview video, I explained I've worked on projects from 1 unit to 800 units, and I've never really seen a difference between one project to another, because I'm very like goal orientated, which means that I look at projects in the same vein. It's just a project. It doesn't matter how big or how small it is. But obviously for a lot of people, they do like big prestigious projects. So if you're like that, then maybe obviously a bigger company is more suited to you. Something like that can tend to be that you need to actually start working for a company to actually realize what motivates you and what interests you. And like I said before, that small companies are more personable, and you may just find that the big companies obviously don't offer that, or a lot of big companies don't have that. I can't speak for every company. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting out there and trying different things and working out what it is. And obviously don't be afraid to go and work for a smaller company and think, oh, I want to work for a bigger company. Or maybe when you're going through the job hunting process, it may be that you want to go for a big company, you just don't get the opportunity. Honestly, big companies don't frown upon small companies. It might be that you go and work for a small company for a couple of years, get some experience under your belt. Obviously, your CV looks massively different after that point, and then you can go back applying for the big companies. They're not going to frown upon it. It's just like any job hunting process, and it's the same for guys in big companies that go job hunting. It's just a matter of getting your CV out there. Obviously, keep going down the process, keep trying, and you will get that opportunity. So hopefully you got some value from the video. I really enjoyed making it. If you've got any questions or comments, whack them down below. I'll come back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.